Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Writing Support Center workshop. My name is Giselle, and today's workshop is titled Synthesis, Putting Text in Conversation. So before we begin this workshop on synthesis, there are a few things you can do to get the most out of this workshop. Now, if you've taken a Writing Support Center workshop before, this message may seem repetitive, so feel free to skip forward until you see the next slide. Otherwise, let me explain what you can do in order to get the most out of this workshop. The first thing is you can download the accompanying activity worksheet. So wherever you access this workshop, there should be a worksheet there, either a PDF or Word version. Download the version that works best for you and fill that out as we go along with this workshop. There will be times where I'll say pause and fill out the worksheet, and that's when you'll go ahead and answer those questions using whatever the content we've covered in the workshop in order to do that exercise. So go ahead and download that now if you haven't. The second thing is to take your time. So this is a recorded workshop, and one great thing about recorded workshops is that you can pause and rewind if needed. So if there's something that seems a little unclear, something you need me to hear, something you need to hear me say again, feel free to rewind or pause if you need to, do one of the exercises, or if you just need to internalize something a little bit longer. So with that, I'm going to cover the workshop goals. The first goal of this workshop is to understand what synthesis is and isn't. So I'm going to just describe what synthesis define it, and then also explain to you what it isn't. I'm going to review examples of synthesis in writing. And I'm also going to practice, you're going to practice synthesizing text for a current assignment. So this workshop will be most useful to students currently writing a research paper or any kind of paper that requires a synthesis of two texts or more. Otherwise, if you're learning about synthesis, this workshop will also be helpful. So before we begin, I usually like to start with an opening reflection just to get your thoughts started, to get an idea where you're at. So on your worksheet, you're going to see the first question that says opening reflection. In your reflection, try to answer these three questions. What do you know about synthesis? So what have you heard in class? What do you think it means based on the word synthesis? How is it different and or similar to summarizing and analyzing? Are you doing these things while you're synthesizing? How are they related? And how have you used synthesis in your writing during the course you're taking now? So whether that be in English 1A course or any other course that requires synthesizing, have you used it already? So go ahead and answer that reflection. There's no right or wrong answers. It's just a way to get you thinking. Pause here and continue when you're ready. All right, so I hope you had enough time to reflect. If not, continue pausing. We're going to now talk about the definition of synthesis. So here's an everyday example. You synthesize when you're deciding which professor you're going to take. You do a bunch of research, you talk to your friends, you ask them who they took, you check Rate My Professor, you do some Googling, and then you ultimately come to a conclusion when you take all that information to make your decision. So synthesis in writing is the same kind of process. You're looking at various texts to understand a certain topic more deeply in order to see the links between the arguments that will eventually inform your own. So you engage in synthesis when you look for areas where your sources agree or disagree, and you try to draw broader conclusions about your topic based on what the sources say. Another thing is you're looking for similar themes between these sources in order to draw broader conclusions. Writing a research paper usually requires synthesizing the available sources in order to provide new insight or a different perspective into your particular topic. So it's different from just restating what each individual source is saying about your topic. You're more looking at how they connect and where they relate. Once you have analyzed the text involved in your research and you've taken notes, you have to turn to the task of actually writing that essay. And your goal is not to just summarize what you find. Critical writing, which is required for research papers, requires that you're communicating your analysis, your synthesis, and the evaluation of your findings to your audience. So synthesis is one big part of what you're doing when you're doing critical writing. And that's just being able to put those texts into conversation that you're using for your research paper. Ultimately, when you synthesize, you're searching for links between texts to help you construct your own thesis. So the reason why you're looking for these links between these texts and similar themes is because you want to be able to come up with your own argument based on what it already exists out there. So in essence, all research papers are also synthesis papers because you're combining that information you have found in ways that help your reader see that information and that topic in a new way. Once you've analyzed these sources and found the connections, you can construct your own argument based on the connections you saw between the texts. So in a nutshell, that's what synthesis is. So synthesis is not summary. That is definitely what it isn't. And that's because a summary simply restates the information in one or more sources without providing new insight or reaching new conclusions. So that's simply what a summary is. It's just describing what the source is about, but it's not necessarily leading you to something new that hasn't been said before. A synthesis, on the other hand, draws on multiple sources to reach a broader conclusion. You need to analyze your sources in order to do this. So in the beginning, in the reflection, when I asked you how is this different or similar to analysis, the fact is synthesis involves analysis. You can't synthesize without analyzing. So the main thing is it's not summary, it's more, it's involved with analysis, and you're trying to draw broader conclusions based on the connections between these texts. So there's some key steps to synthesis. The first step that you want to do when you're synthesizing a text is you need to have at least two sources. You can't synthesize with just one source. You need at least two, and you can have more than two. You can have three or four, but at least two is required. Sometimes your instructor is going to provide these texts. Other times you're going to need to find those texts on your own through research. The second step is after you found your sources, you will need to annotate and analyze the two texts. Like I said, analysis is involved in synthesis. So this strategy is also known as close reading. Annotating helps you synthesize a reading more easily later. So that's why it's important to mark up your text when you're reading it, taking note of important things when you're reading, so that when you come back, you can easily pull out what you need when you come to synthesize the texts and find those connections. The third thing is you want to keep an eye out for themes or traits that these texts have in common. So based on those themes you found, how do they compare to one another? How would these authors agree or disagree? So you're looking for relationships between these two texts when you're synthesizing, as I've said. So there is a strategy to synthesize. So I've given you the definition. I've given you a few key steps of what synthesis essentially is, but there's also a kernel essay format. So if this strategy is great if you're about to write a research paper and you want to be able to put what the authors you found in conversation with one another. Essentially what a kernel essay is, it's a shortened form of a broader essay, which is usually a few paragraphs long, that emphasizes understanding how to format a claim, also known as a thesis statement, and provide evidence for that claim or thesis statement. The goal is that a kernel essay could then be extended into a full essay. So it's a great tool if you want to get started on putting your text in conversation with one another to help you get to your thesis. This synthesis kernel essay format is a great pre-writing strategy to use. So the way that it works is the first step is you would introduce both the text. So that's when you would introduce the author's name, the title of the text, and the common theme and trait. So why are you putting these two texts in conversation together? What things do they have in common? That's step one for this format. The second thing of this format is then you provide your claims. So based on these texts, I believe, what is it that you have come to find based on these two texts? The third is an analysis of author one's argument, so their claim and their evidence. What do you believe their claim is? What evidence have they provided in order to prove that claim? The fourth thing you would do is then you would analyze author two's argument, including their claim and evidence. Once you've provided these two analyses, you would then move on to say what these authors would say to one another. So how would they agree? How do they challenge one another? Like what do they have in common or not? That's what you would do for the fifth step of the kernel essay format. And the sixth is what you say. So based on what these authors are saying, what do you have to bring to the conversation? What conclusion have you come to based on what you've seen in the conversation? And finally, why is this important? Why does this matter? This is also known as your final evaluation or commentary. It's the so what. Why should your reader care about this topic you're talking about? So like I said, this kernel essay format usually is multiple paragraphs. But the example I'm going to show you is a one paragraph version, just a shortened version, but each of these steps can be more than one sentence long. They can be two sentence long, right? Or I'm sorry, a whole paragraph long. So your analysis of author one's argument could be a whole paragraph in itself. Your analysis of author two's argument could be a whole paragraph in itself. So, or it could be that whole analysis could be one paragraph. So a kernel essay format can be multiple paragraphs. But if you're just wanting to write something shorter, you can also do a paragraph. The whole point of this kernel essay strategy is just to get you pre-writing for a bigger assignment. So here is a sample response, a paragraph version of the kernel essay pre-writing strategy that I just showed you. So the first sentence reads, Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue and James Baldwin's If Black English Isn't a Language, Then Tell Me What Is, illustrate the power of language and how it can be used to empower and disempower individuals based on race. All right, so with that first sentence, if we go back to our kernel essay format, that would be the introduction of both texts. Notice how this person put both the author's names in one sentence along with the title of the text that they've written. So that's important. You want to use both when you're introducing a text, you need to use the name of the text and the author of that text. The second sentence reads, those who speak non-standard English or language other than English are often racialized in the United States, and while some are discriminated based on their language, it can be a point of empowerment as well. So if we go back to our format, that's claim number two, based on these texts, I believe. So this is this person's claim. That second sentence is not about the authors or an analysis of their arguments. It's this person's own argument and what they've come to understand based on what the authors are saying. Let's move on to the third part. So for example, Baldwin focuses on how Black English has become a mean of survival for Black Americans, stating, we the Blacks are in trouble, certainly, but we are not doomed and we are not inarticulate because we are not compelled to defend a morality that we know to be a lie. This lie is one put on Black people based on racist assumptions due to skin color and language, yet Black individuals still persist. So that notice that that's two sentences for an analysis of author one's argument. And usually when you're analyzing someone's argument, you do need at least two sentences, but an analysis is usually more heavy, requires multiple sentences. But again, this is just a short example to get you to understand what this format would look like. So that would be the analysis of author one's argument, in this case, James Baldwin's argument. So let's look at the analysis of author two's argument, step 4. Similarly, Ansalua defends her position as a multilingual individual by proclaiming, "I will no longer be made to feel ashamed of existing. I will have my voice, Indian, Spanish, white." Like Baldwin, she is proud of her roots in the face of discrimination and chooses to embrace her multifaceted identity. So I think with this one, that's an analysis of authors two argument, but they're also doing step 5 with what these authors would say to one another. The reason why I would say this is also step 5 is because this person uses a word similarly. So they're putting a direct comparison to Baldwin. So they're essentially saying, how do these two texts agree? How do they disagree? So in their analysis, they're essentially performing that step 5 as well. And then let's look at the next sentence. Baldwin and Ansaldúa explore the topic of racialization, power, and language, but in slightly different ways, with Baldwin focusing in on the complex nature of Black English, and Ansaldúa revealing the duality of being both a Spanish and English speaker. So if we go back to this, that's what you say. So that's what the author of this paragraph is saying. What they've noticed from both arguments, this is what they have to say about that. And again, like I said, when you're doing that kernel essay format, you want to be writing more than one sentence per step, but this is just a abbreviated version of that kernel essay format. And then finally, both authors reveal that non-standard English is empowering despite the existence of racism and discrimination. So finally, why this is important, this author is final evaluation or commentary is that non-standard English is empowering, even though racism and discrimination exist. That's why they are saying their argument matters. That's why they're asking their audience to care about this argument. So in a nutshell, this is how you would use that kernel essay format. This person could then take this paragraph, expand on it in order to make a longer research paper. So you can kind of see how this will turn into a research paper once it's expanded upon. So use this format for your own research papers so that you can get started, get to thinking about how your texts are in conversation with each other. This is a great format for that. So finally, we're on to our practice activity, and this is where you're going to synthesize your sources using the kernel essay. So using 2 articles that have been assigned to you by your instructor or 2 articles you're using for a research paper, practice synthesizing by using the kernel essay format. So if you're currently working on a paper, you should have 2 articles, or there might be 2 articles already that your professor has assigned you in the course of the semester that somewhat relate. Pull those out, practice synthesizing, especially if it's for a research paper you're going to have to turn in, or any essay that requires synthesizing. This activity is super helpful for you to get started on that. I'll put up the format again so that you can do that, but go ahead and find that exercise on your worksheet. Use this format, and once you're done, go ahead and continue with the workshop. All right, I hope you had enough time. If not, please continue pausing. So I just wanted to conclude so that you may understand that synthesis includes these elements. So when you go to write your research paper that includes synthesis, or any paper that includes synthesis, make sure it includes these elements. The first one is it begins with a sentence or phrase that informs readers of the topic of the paragraph. So this is more for the synthesis paragraph in the beginning. You do want to always have that sentence that introduces the author and the title of the text. That's really important with synthesis writing. Number two, it includes information from more than one source. Again, you can't synthesize alone. With one text, you need at least two, you can have three, but the point is you do need more than one source to synthesize. Three, you need to clearly indicate which material comes from which source using lead-in phrases and in-text citations. So if you saw in the example, there were in-text citations for any quotes used. Beware of plagiarism. Accidental plagiarism most often occurs when students are synthesizing sources and they don't tell the reader where the synthesis ends and their own comments begin. So it's really important you mark that with in-text citation and lead-in phrases such as the author states, comma, quotation, right? And then end that quote, or the author states that, provide their commentary, period, and then differentiate where you begin your opinion. Four, you want to make sure your synthesis shows the similarities or differences between the different sources. So you want to keep it informative. And finally, you want to make sure that your synthesis represents the text fairly and accurately. So even if you think it's going to weaken your paper to represent these texts fairly and accurately, you want to look at yourself as simply repeating what the source is saying in fewer words, but in your own words and through your own lens. The fact that you're using your own words does not mean that you're changing what the source is saying. So you want to make sure that you're representing that source accurately and you're not imbuing your own opinion into it until you're providing your analysis, right? So just make sure whenever you're talking about the sources, you're providing that accurate view of the source as how the author intended it to be read. So those are the main 5 things you want to remember about synthesis. Lastly, this is my works cited page. So if you want to learn more about synthesis, these sources will go into more detail. I am going to put the links for the sources in the transcript. So Lumen Learning, link, Purdue OWL, the link, and then Jewel University Online Resources for Writers. That link is also there as well. So be sure to check those links out if you still have questions. If not, I hope to see you virtually at the next Writing Support Center workshop. Thank you and have a nice day.